What was the worst thing of the 20th century? The answer you're going to give is probably more demonstrative of your politics than anything else, but one easy answer comes to mind. The Nazis. Committing genocide as well as invading most of their neighbors and oppressing millions has sort of given them bad reputation. But at the same time, the Nazis were incapable of destroying hundreds of years of mankind's progress in a matter of hours, like the worst invention of the 20th century could: nuclear weapons. Being the sadist I am, it made me wonder, what if you combined these two horrifying things? What if the Nazis developed nuclear weaponry in World War II before the Americans? How would this have affected the rest of history, culture, borders, and the like? That is the question of this alternate history. The Nazis did have a nuclear program in our world, which was based out of Norway, and for a while people thought it had no chance of working. However, recent discoveries of 400 uranium cubes that look like something out of the Marvel universe have shown that they actually could have built a nuclear bomb if they wanted to. And the main reasons they didn't was due to professional rivalry between the different scientists inside the project, as well as the Führer's lack of interest. When Hitler was told in 1939, when the project started, that it would take about 5 years, or until 1944, for the bomb to be finished, he lost interest, and thinking the war would be over by then, saw no purpose to the bomb. In this timeline, that changes. Hitler is greatly intrigued by this war-winning, city-destroying bomb, and so puts his full backing behind it, which is where we run into the second issue, which is, in our world, the US, for their nuclear project, put 500,000 men into the Manhattan Project. Meanwhile, Germany put 1,000th the manpower into their nuclear project. And the US was the largest economy on Earth with nearly twice Germany's population. America could spare 500,000 men. Germany could not. For Germany, that was the difference between winning or losing a battle on the Eastern Front. In our world, the Americans decided to build a uranium and a plutonium bomb at the same time so that they knew that they would have a nuclear bomb that would work by the end of the war. Germany, meanwhile, decided to build just a uranium bomb, which was the simpler of the two processes, and so could have used less than half of the workforce the Americans did to build their nuclear bomb. And the Americans had more resources and a higher level of talent, caused in large part by Jews fleeing the Nazis from Europe. And the Americans started their nuclear project in 1939, the same year as the Nazis, and they finished theirs in 1945, meaning that for the less well-equipped Nazi nuclear program to finish in 1944, they would have had to have started earlier. We run into issues, however, where nuclear fission, the process by which you could make nuclear bombs, was only discovered in our world in 1938, giving the Germans no time to work on their nuclear program earlier. So the first thing we would need to change for this timeline to happen would be that the Germans would have to discover nuclear fission in 1935 or 1936 rather than 1938 to give them a few extra years so that they could actually finish the bomb in 1944 before the Reich's fall. The early stages of World War II would not be that different inside this world. The only real difference would be that 250,000 men would be shifted to Norway to work on the nuclear project there. And most of these men likely come from the Eastern Front, which was where the vast majority of Germans fought in World War II. And I don't think this would actually change the war that much, because the armies involved were so huge, and the Germans already lost the most pivotal campaigns in our world, and so maybe the Nazis would have gotten 20 miles less closer to Moscow in this timeline, or maybe the meat grinder in Stalingrad would have been less close. But we'd have seen the same rough geography of the event, with the Germans getting surprisingly far into Russia before the Soviet glacier would roll them back. So I have no clue what exact month in 1944 the bomb would be discovered, and this matters quite a bit because 1944 was the bloodiest year in all of history. And it started out looking like this, and it ended up looking like this. Being the board game nerd I am, I decided to solve this by using dice. And so here is a dice roll to simulate what month the Nazis would discover the bomb. And the answer is July. This is a quite decisive month, actually. The Third Reich was hemorrhaging, and it was the last time the Nazis really had the chance to not completely lose the war. In June, the Anglo Alliance had landed in Normandy, but they were still fighting their way off the beachheads at this point. The Anglo-Allies had pushed their way half up Italy and had just seized Rome as well. Meanwhile, the Germans had fought a strong campaign against the Russians, and they were still occupying western Ukraine and the Baltics, but the Russians were about to launch Operation Bagration, which broke the back of the German army. If the Germans had the bomb in 1944, it would have almost certainly been used against the Russians. The war in the West was viewed as a normal war by the Nazis. All the sides involved, the British, the Germans, the Americans, were all viewed as Aryans, and so if Germany lost, it wasn't the end of the world. And actually, towards the end of the war, the Germans were purposely not fighting the Western Allies so that they would seize as much of Germany as possible so that as little as possible would be seized by the Russians. The war with Russia was meanwhile as the most pivotal war in history. The Russians were viewed as subhuman, and communism as an evil philosophy that empowered them. Losing to Russia was seen as the end of German civilization and barbarism rolling across the Reich. And so, if the Nazis had a bomb, it would have been dropped on Moscow. The Eastern Front had no clear air superiority, because it was so huge that no one side could dominate it. Thus, if the Nazis wanted to drop their nuke over Moscow by air, which was the only way available to them at this point, they could have. And if the Luftwaffe put enough force behind their punch, they could have dropped the bomb over Moscow. We often forget that World War II-era nuclear weapons were not super powerful. Before the development of the hydrogen bomb in 1952, nuclear weapons only destroyed relatively small areas. For example, this is a map of 1960 nuclear weapons compared to 1945, on important cities you may have heard of. Thus, Moscow, a huge city, if nuked would not be completely destroyed, but the center of the city would be ripped out. This would, however, result in gutting most of the Soviet bureaucracy and administration. Stalin would almost certainly be fine, since he lived in the forests surrounding the city and didn't spend much time in the town center. The Soviet Union likely move its capital to Kazan or possibly Smolensk to keep the war going. A huge shift would be that Moscow was the paramount train hub of the Soviet Union, and if the center of Moscow was gutted out, it would throw the Soviet rail system into mass chaos. Also, having the old rail center being a nuclear wasteland of all things would delay progress quite a bit. The Soviets had an endless supply of expendable slave labor, however, and so would likely have been able to repair the train lines in an inhumanly fast amount of time, but that would still likely take a few months. The Soviet Union was a very top-down military system, in which the low-ranking officery was encouraged to follow orders from above blindly and with no critical thinking whatsoever, even if they were blatantly idiotic. And so the incineration of large parts of the high-ranking Soviet military bureaucracy would put the Soviet military in a very bad place. This, combined with the disruption of train lines for the supply, would make Bagration a complete shambles, an offensive out of 1941 or World War I, and the Russians would lose. Sheer weight in numbers might mean they might push forward a little bit at the start of the offensive, but in the end, the Germans likely inflict horrifying losses on the Russians and force them to stop the offensive. Let me make something abundantly clear. There was no way the Germans could have won this war. They were so outmanned and outgunned that it was just a matter of time. What this would do, however, is it would have delayed Russia's next Germany-killing offensive for 4 or 5 months. In our world, Operation Bagration destroyed German Army Group Center and basically prevented the Germans from ever really fighting an offensive campaign or a strong campaign on the Eastern Front. And in our world, the US was able to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Japan consequentially because they had worked on the uranium and the plutonium bombs at the same time. And so, after those 2 bombs, it would have been many months where the US could drop a 3rd nuke on Japan. Meanwhile, for the Germans, they would only work on their 1 uranium project, and so it would take them many more months to get their 2nd bomb. I frankly doubt the Germans would have put out another bomb at all before the end of the war. With the Allied bombing campaign over Western Europe, as well as the Reich going into territorial freefall in late 1944 and early 1945, it would mean that transportation and production would be greatly slowed, and it seems hard to believe the Germans would put out another bomb before the end of the war. But if they did produce another bomb, they would likely drop it on London in a desperate attempt to get Britain out of the war, and they'd likely use a V-2 rocket due to Allied air superiority over Western Europe. And if the British did lose London, Britain would end up being a country run out of Manchester permanently by the Conservatives with about half the economy it did in our world. It's possible the Americans would have tried to rush their own atomic program since they knew Germany would already have a bomb. However, they were basically going as fast as they could in our world, and so I doubt it. And even if they did develop the bomb before the fall of Germany, I don't think they would have used it on Germany, because they would already know, for all intensive purposes, Germany was already defeated. While meanwhile, a bloody battle would await for control of the Japanese home islands. With the Soviet Union so delayed, it would have been great news for the Western Allies. The West would have pushed further into Europe before the Russians would launch their next offensive. Likely Europe would have looked something more like the one planned in Yalta in 1944, with Hungary, Czechia, and parts of Yugoslavia as parts of the Western coalition. More of Germany would have been part of the West, with a token eastern part, including Berlin, being run by the Soviets. We run into the issue of the Polish rebels, who still likely would have been sold out by the Western Allies, since the Russians would demand control of Poland at all costs for their own national protection. The Soviets would still likely move their capital back to Moscow for pride-based reasons. And if I had to guess around when this would occur, I'd say around 1960, after the radiation had been cleaned up. But Kazan would still probably remain the most important city in Russia, because it would have been the capital during the post-war economic boom, and after the capital would move back to Moscow, the Russian economy would start to stagnate. And so today, Kazan would still be a very important city. With more of Europe, the West would be in a stronger position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in this timeline's Cold War. And this might result in the Russians acting more aggressively, as they'd be in a more insecure position. However, I don't think this would result in war, as the Russians would already have experienced one of their cities being nuked, and so wouldn't want to provoke another war in which so many more bombs would fall onto their cities. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment, subscribe, stay tuned for future videos, and tell a friend. As always, thank you very much, have a good day, and see you next time.